years. In 2000, he moved to a hospital that has a very long name, but in short, part of the name is St. John of God in Brescia. Okay. I'm not even sure how I can pronounce the rest of the name of that hospital. Anyway, he became the chief neurophysiology laboratory. Then 2 years later, in 2004, he was appointed as associate professor in human physiology in University of Brescia. And yes, in 2010, he was qualified as a full professor in human physiology, and in 2011 he became president-elect of Italian Society of Psychophysiology. Currently, he is coordinating the Center of Neuroscience at that hospital, St. John of God in Brescia Hospital, and the University of Brescia. He is in the editorial board of a few journals, and he has many journal and conference publication. For the detail of his speech, please review one of my previous emails. With that, I would like to welcome Dr. Miniussi to talk about non-invasive brain stimulation on people with Alzheimer's disease. I forgot one thing to say before welcoming him, that his group, he is one of the very few groups who started to apply TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulus, for treatment of Alzheimer's. He says that he's not the first, but definitely his group, and along with the Israeli group and a group in Egypt, have been one of the pioneers, some of the pioneer 3 groups who started this field of research. Please join me to welcome Dr. Miniussi.
Well, thank you, Zara. Thank you for inviting me this seminar today, also for this introduction. What I will try to do today is to show you how it's possible to use non-invasive brain stimulation in Alzheimer. What I will do is I will tell you just a small part of the bigger story. And the small part of the story is actually the story that was developed in Brescia, in the mine laboratory. Brescia is here in the middle of North Italy, because I'm sure no one of you have ever heard of Brescia before, so it's about here. Let me start showing you this picture. Can any of you spot something unusual in this picture? If you pay a bit of attention to the faces of these players, you will realize that all the players got exactly the same face. Now that I've told you, it's quite easy for you to see this. You can realize easily that they got all of them the same face, and also in the future you will have no problem to realize this, to point out this. This can be defined cognitive plasticity. Cognitive plasticity is the ability of the system to acquire or improve skills through a process that is defined as learning. This is the psychological level of learning, and clearly this level is strictly related, is close tied to change at nervous neural level. So change in learning, cognitive plasticity, is strictly related to change in the system anatomy or function. That is defined cerebral plasticity or neuroplasticity. So we now know that neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change itself, but that ability is present in humans not just in our early stage, not just when we are kids. That ability is present during the whole life. And that has been shown mainly by the work done by the Merthin these people showed that the maps, you cannot see actually. Is it possible to turn off this light? I don't know if you can see, this is part of the map over this somatosensory cortex that represents the hand of this case of the monkey. As you can see, there are 5 digits, and you can trace 5 areas over the cortex. Each of that area is a representation of the hand. So if you actually change the peripheral of information, so if you remove a finger, what will happen is that the area that is representing that finger after a few weeks is not anymore present, as you can see here. And what you can see is that the area of the neighbor fingers are actually enlarged, so they occupied the area that was before belonging to the third finger. That is plasticity induced by lesion. But we do have plasticity also in more normal situations. For example, here, if you train the monkey to do a task with 2 fingers, you will end up, after a while, realizing that the 2 fingers that are being used to do this task are actually increase their representation at cortical level. So the representation that was about this size at the beginning is increased after the use of these 2 fingers. And we do know that this is not just in animals, it's also, this kind of phenomenon is also present in humans. For example, in expert musicians, some part of the brain, some area of the brain are more developed than non-musician subjects, like motor cortex, the temporal planum, the corpus callosum, and also the cerebellum. And that is neuroplasticity. So depending on what we do with our brain, we do shape with our brain. So depending on our interests, we can shape the representation of that interest in the brain. That is how to change the working of the brain from an internal perspective. But recently, thanks to technology, we also learned that it's possible to help the brain to change through several devices. Device that can be defined sort of pacemaker for the brain. And what I'm referring to is substantially defined as non-invasive brain stimulation or transcranial stimulation. Non-invasive brain stimulation refers to 2 methods. One is transcranial magnetic stimulation, and the other one is this method here, TMS. The other one is transcranial electric stimulation. I will start to show you, I will introduce briefly TMS, and then I will show you some experiment that we did in Brescia using TMS. And then if we got time, I will introduce very briefly transcranial electric stimulation and show you some experiments using this approach. So let's start with TMS. The basic aspect of TMS is the principle of mutual induction. When you let the current go through a conductor, you got that current associated with the magnetic field. So in this case, the current goes through the wiring, is associated with the magnetic field. In the same measure that a current, action potential, going through a conductor, an axon, you produce a magnetic field. And you can actually record the magnetic field with magnetoencephalography. So this is basic aspect. So what we need is currents. And what you see here is substantially a machine that produces current, and then eventually it stores that current in this capacitor here, and then a conductor. And here you got the conductor. So a coil is the conductor. So what you have to do is let the current go through this coil, this solenoid, and you will have your magnetic field. And for the principle of mutual induction, letting current go through the conductor will produce this magnetic field. And now for the same principle, if you introduce another conductor in magnetic field, you will have a current. Now if you can find a confined subject, what you can do is move that piece of iron and put another piece of iron is actually our brain. Our brain is a good conductor. So what you can do is to substantially induce a current over the brain. So what TMS does is to induce a current in the brain through a magnetic field. And the advantage of this method is that, as you know, magnetic field it crosses unchanging all the extracortical layers because there are no conductors. And it can induce, therefore, this current over the cortex. That current is substantially a movement of ions. Those ions moving from outside to inside or vice versa of neurons will induce a depolarization of neurons. So substantially, what TMS does is through a magnetic field, induce an electric field that will depolarize neurons. And those neurons, at that point, once they are depolarized, they will release neurotransmitter. And so they will activate a given system. So, for example, this system was developed mainly to study the motor system. So, for example, if you apply a TMS pulse over the motor cortex, what you do is to stimulate interneurons over the motor cortex. Those interneurons will activate, will release neurotransmitter, and will activate the corticospinal tract, initially the premotor neurons, and then the motor neurons. And then what you have is a twitch, a contraction of muscle activated by your TMS pulse. And you can record that contraction here with electromyography. And so here is when you deliver your TMS pulse, and after a few milliseconds, you can record a response, a contraction of this muscle. And that contraction is called motor evoked potential, MIP. Now, the amplitude of that response has been taken as an index of cortical excitability, because if the cortex is in a sort of normal situation, what you got is this. If the cortex is more excitable, so you can activate more the cortex in some way with a magnetic pulse, what you will have will be a bigger response, like this red one. If the cortex is less excitable, what you will have is a smaller response. So, delivering this TMS pulse over the motor cortex and measuring this motor evoked potential, you can establish what is the state of excitability of the cortex. Let me show you exactly what's happening with this. If it works, I suppose. So what I got here is a video showing exactly this. This is the coil, got a different shape than the previous one. This one is more focal, and I will apply magnetic stimulation in different parts of the brain, and you will see that I will be able to induce a twitch of the muscle only when I'm putting the coil exactly over the motor cortex and not in other cortex. Actually, the magnetic field lasts less than 1 millisecond, and you will hear a twitch, a click. That is when magnetic field is delivered. Can you hear? So now I'm holding the coil with the wrong orientation over the motor cortex, so I shouldn't induce any response.
Devo spostarmi. Giro il coil.
Sorry, that's Italian.
Cambio non interrompere il coil.
So now I'm going sort of closer to the right position.
Della stimolazione. Adesso devo tornare al controllo, adesso mi sposto anteriormente.
Now I'm going frontally, so I'm moving away from the motor area. You see that it's happening. Parietal area.
L'area parietale.
Nothing is happening. And then back again to the motor cortex.
Poi controllo leggermente. Riattiviamo perciò la via discendente motoria e abbiamo una stazione molto più facile. Ok.
So So substantially what you do is you activate this corticospinal tract without the willing of the subject. You just depolarize neuron of the cortex, and those neurons activate the muscles. Okay. So now, with a single pulse, you can induce this motor response. But then you can also deliver more than one single pulse in a train of stimulation and repeat that pulse with different frequency. So that's called repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation. And you can apply repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation with an approach that has been defined as low frequency or an approach that's been defined as high frequency. This division, not just a random division, is based on empirical data. And low frequency refers to all the stimulation that are about 1 Hz or below, and high frequency, all the stimulations that are from 5 to 25 Hz. And as you can see, also you can divide this type of stimulation in a continuous stimulation like this one, or intermittent stimulation like this one. It has been shown that depending on the frequency of stimulation, you can induce different cortical activity. You can modulate the cortical excitability depending on the type of approach that you are using. That has been demonstrated using the previous approach, so recording the motor block potential. So what you do, you deliver a single pulse of the motor cortex, you measure the response of the muscles, here it is, and then what they did in this experiment was to deliver for half an hour 600 TMS pulses in the sham condition, so a placebo condition. After an hour, they stopped the stimulation. After 5 minutes from the end of the stimulation, they recorded again the motor evoked potential, so a single pulse, the sham stimulation was over the motor cortex. They recorded again with a single pulse the response of the motor cortex, and as you can see, they couldn't find any difference. Then they did again the experiment, again baseline. This time they applied 1 Hz stimulation, so real stimulation over the motor cortex, 600 stimuli for half an hour. And then 5 minutes after the end of the stimulation, they recorded again the motor evoked potential, and what they found was a reduction in the amplitude of that response. So it is believed that low frequency stimulation induced a decrease in cortical excitability. Then they did again the experiment, baseline again, but this time they applied 10 Hz stimulation, and what they found is that after half an hour of 10 Hz stimulation, same amount of stimuli, same amount of time, just clearly spaced between them in the burst of 10 Hz, what they found was an increase in the motor block potential. So the main idea is that with stimulation from 5 to 25 Hz, you can induce an increase in cortical excitability. You can go even higher than 25 Hz, but there are some problems there in terms of safety. It could be dangerous in terms of inducing seizure if you use higher intensity. And the main idea is that using this kind of approach, you can change the excitability of the cortex, and probably this change in excitability is related to synaptic effect in terms of long-term potentiation or long-term depression. Now, so this is the base of TMS. It has been shown that TMS, application of TMS over different parts of the cortex can induce an enhancement in performance in normal subjects. And I will present you some specific data on this. There are quite a lot of evidences showing this in reasoning, word association, DigiSpan, so number of information that you can, number of numbers that you can recall, picture word matching, and so on. But there are many data showing that when you apply high frequency TMS over a given area, you can improve the ability of the subject to perform the task. Several years ago, we wanted to study the role of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in naming. Specifically, we were interested in replicating data from a neuroimaging study, PET study, showing that this area, left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, was more active when the subject was asked to process a verb. So was actually asked to name a picture that was representing an action. But as you know, neuroimaging is a correlative method, so you cannot, if you ask the subject to do this action and you see an increase of activity in an area, what you do is a correlation between the behavior of the subject and this activity. But you don't know if it's a direct relation between the two. And with TMS, the idea was that if you can stimulate that area and you can modify the performance of the subject while he's doing this task, you can establish a causal relationship between brain and behavior. So we did this experiment, and what we did was present the normal subject, normal young subject, to present them some pictures. Those pictures could be actions, like this one, or object like this one. And while we were presenting these pictures, we were stimulating the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex at 20 Hz for 600 milliseconds during the presentation of this picture. And we had a condition where we were stimulating the left hemisphere, another one the right hemisphere, and a third control condition where we were using a sham stimulation over the vertex. So this was the task. And the subject was asked to name as fast as possible these pictures. And here you got the results. So what we were recording was the verbal reaction time. How fast was the subject to name those pictures? And here you got the responses for action and object. The imaging data is suggesting that that area is not involved in naming of object. And here you got the three experimental conditions: the placebo stimulation, the sham, the stimulation of the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, that should be the cortex involved in this task, and the stimulation of the homologous contralateral area. As you can see, for object, we couldn't find any difference between the three conditions. But when we analyzed actions data, what we found was that there was a decrease in reaction time for stimulation of the left hemisphere during denomination of action. So at that time we were interested to establish the role of this area, and we didn't really pay much attention if what we were finding was a decrease in reaction time of the naming of the subject. So what we did at this point, say, okay, we established the role of this area, but what's going to be next? We found a facilitation. Maybe we can use this kind of approach to evaluate a subject that got some cognitive difficulty problems, to see if we can improve that kind of problems. It was just sort of random finding, serendipity, finding this facilitation. So what we did next was to test elderly subjects, normal elderly subjects, exactly the same task, and we had exactly the same results for object denomination. And what we had for action this time was just the same day before for left stimulation, but we also found a facilitation after stimulation of the right hemisphere that should not be involved in that task. But actually, this result is not so surprising because it fits very well a theory, the so-called arrow theory, where it is suggested that in elderly people, a given area specialized for a task, you lose control on that task because there is a losing of neurons, there's a losing of power in that area. You lose control of that task, and if the subject wants to perform at a good level, that is just to recruit contralateral homologous area to do this task. So that theory has been proven with neuroimaging data, and we found exactly the same result here. So stimulating both hemispheres, we could induce facilitation in naming. Those were elderly subjects, and also I show you normal subjects. So what can we do at this point with this magnetic stimulation? Can we stimulate the brain of someone to make a very powerful brain? Can we potentiate some function? Probably we don't, because we might end up to potentiating some wrong function, not sort of ideal behavior after that. And so probably what is going to be better than this is to use this kind of approach in a brain where something is not working, like for example in Alzheimer patients. Alzheimer patients do have problems with denomination of action, or even at some point even an object. So what we did was to test a group of Alzheimer's patients with this. These were the patient 1580 patients with this kind of value in the new mental test. Is a sort of test that evaluates very generally what is the cognitive state of the patient. And 18, it means that the sort of middle score, the maximum score is 30. I normally get 28 because when they ask me which day is today, I don't know, so I lose 1 point, for example. And then they ask me, where are you, which floor, I don't know also that answer. And so I lose another point of that. So, but anyway, the 18 is sort of middle way. And so we tested these 15 patients. The task was exactly the same: object, action, and then stimulation of left or right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But this time we didn't record verbal reaction time, because those patients do have problems with denomination. And what we recorded was accuracy, so how many items they were able to denominate. What we found, so here you got sham stimulation, left stimulation, right stimulation, no effect for object denomination, but why we were stimulating during action denomination, we found that in sham stimulation they denominate 30% of the items, while after left or right stimulation they improve their performance to 50%. So at this point we said, okay, we had a facilitation, but this facilitation, is it reliable or not? So we did another experiment with other still Alzheimer patients, but with a different degree of Alzheimer state, let's say. So we tested two groups, both were 12 subjects, one with a mini-mental below 70, and the other one with mini-mental above 70. As you can see here, we replicated the data from the previous group, no effect for object denomination, and a facilitation for action, left after left or right stimulation. While with more severe patients, we found the same result for action, but also a result for objects. So at that point, those subjects, those patients, are compromised also in the domination of object. That should be an easier task. And we could induce facilitation also for that task. So you should consider that what I've showed you are just experimental data. They don't have any clinical value, because as soon as the experiment is finished, this facilitation goes away. So there's not a leftover effect. The effect is present just in the moment of the stimulation. So it doesn't have a clinical value in this step. So what we thought is, if we can induce a long-lasting effect, not just an effect for the time of stimulation, we might find new prospects for using this kind of approach in neurorehabilitation of Alzheimer patients. Not actually just Alzheimer patient, because this kind of application would be good for any kind of pathology that involve a change in plasticity of the brain. Anyway, what we did next step was to test 10 patients, but this time we wanted to repeat the stimulation, not just a single session, but more than one session, to see if we can induce a permanent change. So we tested 10 patients. Those patients were submitted to these protocols, One group was evaluated at the beginning, then it was submitted to 2 weeks of daily stimulation for 25 minutes, 5 days a week, for 2 weeks. Then we evaluate them again, and then other 2 weeks of stimulation, and then evaluation at 4 weeks, and also evaluation after 12 weeks. This one was one group, the real group, and then we had a placebo real group, a sham real group, where they were evaluated, and the first 2 weeks they were submitted to a placebo stimulation, sham stimulation. Then after the 2 weeks they were submitted evaluation, and then submitted to a real stimulation. And here are the results. We didn't find a significant change in naming, but we found a change in the sentence comprehension. So here you got the baseline, the two groups, the placebo real group and real group. So they both started from this point. The placebo group didn't change after 2 weeks of placebo stimulation, while the real group changed. We had an improvement, significant improvement after 2 weeks of real stimulation. At this point, the placebo group was submitted to real stimulation, and what we found was that the placebo group had an improvement very similar to the improvement that we had with the real group. The real group that was continuing real stimulation didn't really change. We had a sort of a small worsening of the performance, but then back to the beginning. And that improvement was present also 12 weeks later. So it was long-lasting improvement. We were not the only ones showing this kind of effect. There are also some data from a single subject with primary progressive aphasia. Those subjects were evaluated baseline. So here you got the performance of it's just single subject. Here you got the performance of the subject in a verb task. No changes after the first evaluation, 15 days later, other 15 days later, no changes. Then they applied 20 hours stimulation. And what they found was after a week of stimulation, they found an increase in the performance. And that increase in performance lasted for about 2 months. You see, these are all the evaluation. And after 2 months, it went down. For another month, it was about here. And then they were submitted to sham stimulation. After sham stimulation, no change in the performance for 1 month. And then again, real stimulation. After real stimulation, they had again an improvement for another 2 months and went back again. This is one study. There was another study from a group from Israel. They evaluate another group of 8 patients, Alzheimer patients, using other scope. And as you can see, in this case, the lower the score, the better is the subject. There was a decrease in the scoring after treatment. So here you got pre-treatment, and after 6 weeks, they had an improvement that was lasting after 4 months, about 4 months. Also, another group in Egypt had similar results showing that high-frequency stimulation used facilitation in comparison to low-frequency stimulation. Okay, if you are not bored at this point, I'll go over the other bit. So this is TMS. The other part is related to the other method, that is transcranial electric stimulation. I should underline this. TMS is a neurostimulation approach. So you deliver TMS pulse and you induce a depolarization of neurons. So those neurons will release neurotransmitter and will activate a circuit. With this approach, you don't have this kind of result. This approach is a neuromodulation approach. In this case, what you do, you change the threshold of neurons. So you neuromodulate. You just change the state of the neurons. It's not a new technique. It has been around for a while, but it has been sort of rediscovered in the last 10 years. And you can see it's a very small device. Substantially, it's 9-volt battery, something very simple. 2 electrodes, and those are the stimulated electrodes. One is called the active electrode, and the other one is called the reference electrode, even if both of them are active, because if you got another stimulation in one, you will have cathode stimulation in the other one. Anyway, what you do normally is just put one electrode that you are interested to use, for example, the anodal one or the cathodic one, in the area of interest for you, and the other electrode, you try to put it in a so-called not active area, so an area that's not involved in what you are studying. It's not, it doesn't induce changes in the brain that can affect your results. Transcranial electric stimulation, the most known of this transcranial electric stimulation is actually transcranial direct current stimulation, the so-called TDCS. With TDCS, what you do is to apply anodal or cathodal currents at a very weak intensity, from 1 to 2 milliamperes. And so substantially you apply those homogeneous current over a given area for a few minutes, 5-10 minutes. And the aim is to change the excitability of those areas. It has been shown in animal study, cat study, recording from the occipital cortex, that this is the control condition, no stimulation. This is spontaneous firing rate over the occipital cortex of a cat. If you apply cathodic stimulation over the occipital cortex, you can see there is decrease in spontaneous activity. While if you apply another stimulation, you can see that there is an increase in spontaneous activity. So what you do when you apply these custom currents, you don't induce depolarization, you just change this, the threshold of the neurons, of the membranes. And so you can increase or decrease the excitability of those neurons. It has been shown that with TDCS you can get similar results than TMS. So here you got the baseline, placebo, no effect, baseline, cathodic stimulation over the motor cortex induced a reduction of the motor neuron potential. Another stimulation induced an increase of the motor neuron potential. And here you got an example. If you apply, this is the baseline, so this is this value here, this one. If you apply cathodic stimulation for 5 minutes at 1 milliampere, you will have a decrease. So this is the control. Here you have a decrease in amplitude of the motor neuron potential. That decrease lasts for about 4 minutes, then it's back to baseline. While with another stimulation, you have an increase of the response. Again, that increase lasts about 4 or 5 minutes. So with TDCS, you have a similar result that you have when you apply high or low frequency TMS. Once again, there are several papers showing that applying another stimulation, you can get facilitation, increase in performance in several tasks, but you can see just a few of them. So at this point, what we thought was, why don't we try to use anodal and eventually cathodic stimulation to induce exactly the same result that we had using TMS. So what we did was to stimulate the same area, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, with anodal stimulation, cathodic stimulation, and placebo, to see if we can induce effect. Mainly, we were interested in facilitation. We applied that stimulation for 8-10 minutes before the task execution, and then we asked the subject to execute the task. We did 2 experiments with just some small differences in parameters, but substantially here you got the results that were pretty similar in 2 experiments. Another stimulation induced a facilitation in naming in comparison to sham stimulation. It's quite common to find a facilitation with another stimulation and not an inhibition with cathodic stimulation. As you can see here we found a sort of inhibition. Here we found a sort of mild facilitation compared to sham. The story is a little bit complicated, but we were interested mainly in this part here because we wanted to use this kind of approach in Alzheimer patients. Before that, we did the same experiment, but this time we did 2 conditions. One was before the experiment, and the other one was during the experiment. And we tested 2 groups. So we replicated the previous data, control condition, offline, before denomination. We found a facilitation, but we found facilitation also online stimulation, so during the task execution. So this is a replication of previous data, and this part is new. And we tested also elderly subjects. What we found was that in elder subjects, offline stimulation does induce a facilitation. Sorry, offline stimulation doesn't induce a facilitation. Only the online stimulation can induce a facilitation of the performance. This result is suggesting that you should pay attention in your protocol, and depending on the type of subject that you are using, you are testing, you are evaluating, the effects that you can have can be different. Here, it can be very simple. Elderly subject might have a sort of plasticity system different than young subject. Here you induce a facilitation, and that facilitation lasts after the end of stimulation for, let's say, you stimulate for 10 minutes, and the facilitation is there for another 10 minutes. With elderly subject, you don't have this kind of facilitation. Probably is due to alteration of membrane permeability due to calcium channels, or something that's altered, is changing in elderly subjects. While you can get a facilitation if you apply this kind of stimulation online. So this experiment is suggesting that when you are applying your stimulation, it might be important depending on the type of subject you are using. So the last experiment that we did was to apply the same protocol than before that we used with TMS, but this time using TDCS, and we applied another TDCS over the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in 14 Alzheimer patients. The protocol was exactly the same: baseline, 2 weeks of stimulation evaluation, 2 weeks of stimulation evaluation for one group, and sham the first 2 weeks for the other group. So those are the results. What we had was no results at all. So beginning real stimulation, after 2 weeks, you see not changes in object naming, action naming, whatever, and real stimulation, not significant changes. Here, the first 2 weeks of sham simulation, we had not significant improvement compared to this group. And also, when we look at a mini-mental examination, what we found was that in the real group, we had no changes at all, while in the sham group, we had not significant improvement. So the conclusion can be, okay, TDCS doesn't work like TMS, so we weren't able to induce any facilitation. But what we did here, it was a mistake, because as I just told you, TDCS is a neuromodulation technique. So what it does is increase excitability of the brain, or increase excitability of the stimulated area. It doesn't induce depolarization, so activation of the network. Just change the excitability. So what we did was to stimulate patients that weren't doing anything at all. They were just sitting on the chair, and we were increasing their excitability. And after 25 minutes of stimulation, we were just switching off the machine, and the patient was going at home. So he was not doing anything at all. That increase in excitability was going down as before. It's like to give a drug to make a subject faster, to run faster, and then you leave the subject in the chair. You may not run him. And so how can you make the subject running faster if you give the drug when he's not running? And so that was probably the mistake with this kind of approach. The idea here is that you can increase the excitability of the system, but then if you don't activate a specific circuitry by a specific task, you cannot really potentiate, you cannot really take advantage of this increase in facilitation. So the idea is that we should take we should pay attention when we are running experiments, because several parameters like the type of subject that we are testing, studying, or what we are doing while we are studying this subject might be very important. And the conclusion for this experimental part is that what we should do is to combine two approaches, so use non-invasive brain stimulation to induce plasticity, to increase excitability of the system. That's one part, and the other part is to induce through a training, a specific task, plasticity of the system. So what you have here is promoting associative learning through what is known as Hebbian-like plasticity. So you increase the ability of the system to produce plasticity, and also you activate specifically a circuitry with a task. Just to conclude why non-invasive brain stimulation should work with AD, the idea is that Alzheimer's disease is not an all or nothing pathology. You don't have, like in stroke, you don't lose a lot of neurons in the same area, and that's it. You got sort of general reduction of the system. You got a loss of part of the neural population. And what you end up is a reduction in excitability of cortical neurons. What might happen is that this reduction in excitability induces a depotentiation of some cognitive circuit specific for the function that you are testing, or for any function. This, at the end, is resulting in impaired function. So you have a system, the system is still there, but you have a depotentiation of the system. So the neurons, the connection are still there, but since you are not using that connection, become weaker and weaker. It might be that using this kind of stimulation, TMS or eventually TDCS combined with the task, you might induce sort of gradual readjustment of intact, because the vector is still there, but it's just functionally suppressed due to the reduction of the synaptic strength. And we do know that Alzheimer is got a problem at synaptic level, at synaptic communication. So these data that I presented to you support the idea that brain stimulation induced change in synaptic strength are the first, probably the most essential step through a sort of recovery or maybe a maintenance of a function. And you can potentiate a specific network and therefore increasing the behavior of the subject in that specific task. And so thank you for your attention.
Before we open the room for the questions, just want to announce that Dr. Miniussi has a workshop tomorrow at Riverview Health Center in Administration Building, room 450, which is our rTMS lab. For those of you who are interested, you are welcome. The room space is limited, but nevertheless, if you're interested, you're welcome to attend. Okay? If you have any questions, please go ahead.
So I have two questions. First question is on the slide where you were describing the rise and fall in excitability as a result of transcranial current stimulation. What is
this one or
this one? What is the technology used to measure the rise and fall, the MEP in this
yeah,
way?
it's TMS. So what you do is you deliver a TMS pulse on the motor cortex, you measure the motor potential, then you apply. So this is this point, you apply TCS for 5-10 minutes, and then you measure again each minute. You deliver a single pulse or more than one pulse, and you measure again the amplitude of the response.
And my second question is about the current level used in TDCS.
Yeah.
That's equivalent to 1 to 2 milliamperes. And at such low current levels, one would be tempted to believe that the current will simply be dissipated through skin and bone.
Yes,
and will not actually have an effect on the neuronal membrane potential.
You're right, because most of the currents just goes everywhere, not in the brain. A very small amount of the current goes to the brain, and the proof is this. Otherwise, how would you explain the change in the amplitude of this response? I can tell you something that I didn't present here. We also record EEG during before and after TTCS and measure the excitability of the brain using TMS. So we record EEG, we deliver single pulse of TMS over the stimulated cortex and see if we can get a change in the amplitude of the response. What we found was that with a longer stimulation, we have an increase in the response that we can use at cortical level, not at peripheral level, so not MRP. We had an increase in the response, and also with cathodic stimulation, we had a decrease in the response over the stimulated area. So we got result, further result in this direction. And also, well, there are several studies now confirming this approach.
Thanks.
Very interesting talk. So in any of the patients that you tested, did you ever elicit any seizure activity?
No, not so. That was the main concern, but the answer is no. We tested not just Alzheimer patients, we tested also stroke patients. The risk is much higher in that situation. We never had any problem of that kind.
And I see that you, in some cases, classified the Alzheimer's patients by level of severity into moderate,
Yes.
or mild, and then moderate to severe.
Yeah.
Did you also try to look at perhaps differences in early stage versus late stage?
No. No, we never did it. But it should be based on the mini-mental score, because at least, I mean, those patients, yes, here. So those patients should be more in an early stage than those here.
So anyone else doing TMS, have they ever elicited seizure activity in the patient?
In Alzheimer patients or?
Yeah, in Alzheimer's patients.
Not that I'm aware. There's actually a website where you can record all these kind of events. Most of the data are on stroke patients or even normal subjects using high frequency stimulation. There are not that many subjects.
When you say high frequency, you mean around 20 hertz or something?
20 Hz, yes, 20 or 15 Hz. I don't remember exactly, but normally high frequency. The risk is to use seizures with high frequency. And also, all these experiments are just experiments. All these events that are being recorded in these sites are normally in patients with high risk of seizure.
Thank you.
I have a question on the TMS. What kind of magnetic field strength you're dealing with?
Okay, it depends on many factors, but substantially what we were using here is the maximum output is 2.2 Tesla. We were using the maximum output with the big coil, but we use also, depending on the size of the coil, clearly the strength change, but on average is about, let's say, maximum we get up to 3 Tesla.
So, is there a study, so you're showing the dependence on frequency, but what about the strength of the magnetic field versus response? Is there any study on that, or?
Yes, there are some studies showing that based on this, there's not very strict relation, but based on the strength, you can have a difference in results. So the strongest is the field, the strongest are the results. But the problem is that the magnetic field is over. Using a standard coil is over after 2 centimeters. So, I mean, if you consider the distance from the skull to the cortex, if you decrease the intensity, you don't reach the cortex. That's the main problem.
But what's the highest you can have and keep it safe?
In terms of intensity,
Like strength. Yeah.
okay.
This seems like a very high magnetic field to me, but you're saying this is pretty safe.
Nothing goes in
For such a long time. So,
very little of the pulse goes in. It's not actually dissipate a lot of them, more than 95% of the energy.
Probably when you reach the cortex, you are 90% below of the intensity that you deliver. What I can tell you is, if I'm correct, the strongest coil they use reach 4 Tesla. It's a very small coil, so you're not even able to stimulate the cortex. If you use this coil on the motor cortex, you cannot even induce a motor low potential because you don't reach the cortex. Because it's very intense, but this coil is very small, and therefore really feel it's very small.
Maybe someone is also asking to know what intensity the rTMS pulses are. Is that correct? Usually the protocol is to find the motor threshold, resting motor threshold, over the motor cortex by single pulses, and then give a train of pulses between 90 to 100% of that person's motor threshold.
In order to decide it's a 1 Tesla.
Yeah. Arsen's isn't behavioral. Have you looked at any biochemical or physiological changes of the
Not in normal subjects. We did in Alzheimer subjects and in depressed patients, because we did several years ago. We did an experiment in depressed patients. We were trying to see if we could find any difference in dopamine. I don't remember exactly, but we did several things, but we couldn't find any significant results in this. So we were not able to induce any change in dopamine or
Acetylcholine.
sorry.
Acetylcholine.
Yes, yes. We were looking several things, but I mean, not significant data in that case. But we are working now on data of Alzheimer patients. It seems that stimulation, rTMS, high frequency TMS, increase the amount of BDNF in the peripheral blood.
Do we have an explanation for describing the difference that we observed between the right TMS and the left TMS?
Do you mean between young and elderly subjects?
Between young and elderly, and also I think that there were two approach, right TMS and left TMS according to the science.
Yeah. Okay. The left hemisphere should be the hemisphere that is carry-on language. And so that is exactly what we were expecting for all our subjects, and that is what we found in young subjects.
Mm-hmm.
So only stimulation of the left hemisphere induced this change in behavior. We were stimulating the other area just as a control condition. We wanted the same area, the same everything, but just an area that we were quite sure that was not involved in language. And we were quite surprised when we found that in Alzheimer and elderly. But as I said, it fits perfectly with this. The name is Harold. Is a theory proposed by Cabeza, suggesting that as you get older, you lose neurons when you are very young, your brain is not specialized for cognitive function. Cognitive function are carried on by different areas. As you grow up, an area take control in a given task, and so, for example, for this task, the left dorsolateral area becomes specialized to carry that task, and it will not let any other area to do it. As you become older, what happens is that area becomes weaker, so it needs help. And we show that homologous contralateral area are activated when you got a good performance. If you don't have a good performance, that is correlated with just activation of left area in elderly subjects. So MRI data are showing that when you do this kind of task with high performance, you got bilateral activation, and those subjects are called high performer. While when you got a low performance, we are talking about elderly subjects, low performance, you got just activation of left area. So you don't ask for help to the other area. So the explanation is that the system is losing its specialization, and it's you got compensation of by the other hemisphere.
Thank you very much. I have another question regarding the measurement that you use. Have you ever seen any change in this MMSE score that you calculated, even in those cases that you saw a significant difference in accuracy?
Sorry, do you mean
There were some cases that that in the accuracy you have seen.
those data?
Yes. Yes.
So
No, not those data. Where that you had some improvement in the accuracy of the verbal estimation.
oh, I see, the TMS.
Yes.
So what we did in those patients was not just to test verbal accuracy, we did test other function, attention, memory, and so on. And we were expecting a very specific result because we were stimulating that area. And actually, so you mean these results here, the change in the accuracy?
You didn't expect to see any change in the MMSE score here after that one?
Not really, because this one, as I said, it is just, you get an effect very briefly after the stimulation, and then you're not sort of trying to use TMS as a pacemaker of the brain, and then leave the effect there. You're just stimulating, get effect very briefly, change probably the amount of neurotransmitter that's released at synaptic level, but that is after, when you're done after, I wouldn't even say a few minutes, it's probably after a few seconds the effect is over. And so, no, we didn't see any, absolutely any change in the millimeter. And we were not expecting any change in millimeter, even in this experiment, because once again, we were stimulating one area and we were expecting very specific result.
Thank you.
A different question than the one I thought about before. Do you see any change in excitability in patients with Alzheimer's when they're on acetylcholinesterase inhibitors? Does that make any change?
All of them were under treatment, and we didn't really measure excitability. Actually, we did measure excitability in those patients that were stimulated with TDCS, but the results were suggesting that we were not successful. We did record EEG, and we didn't find any significant data in those patients, but we didn't in the TMS patients, so I cannot give an answer on that.
One more question.
These are all PC method.
Sorry?
These are all PC method.
They are all?
The
DC.
PC method?
What do you mean to see they stay there? No.
No, like not the repetition one. Like the one that you apply is a DC one, so it's like a one pulse.
It's just one pulse. It lasts 200 microseconds.
And
So-
with a constant level, so it's not alternating.
No, it is depending on the type of the TMS that you are using. The one that we were using is you got double. It's alternating. It's just a double.
So what is the frequency of that?
Well, it's last 100 and so the wall it's 150 microseconds.
So it's a mechanism.
That's the sorry.
So it should be less than 1 megabits per second.
Should be less than.
1 megabits.
Yes, but it's just a single pulse. It's just a single waveform.
Yeah, and so it is alternating, so it should penetrate. So what would be the depth that it can get into the brain?
I'm not sorry.
The depth of penetration, she's
Oh,
asking.
the depth of penetration is 2 centimeters from the surface of the coil.
So it's just trying to decide that it should be stimulating, not anything further inside.
She's an electromagnetic
Yeah, no, I understood that.
expert, yes. There are a lot of room for EM group to come and improve TMS machines. TMS machines, despite the fact that they are very expensive, we noticed recently that it is very primitive from engineering point of view. there are a lot of room for EM engineers to come and improve, designing better coils, designing better machines. Please do. Encourage your supervisor. I invited him tomorrow, he said he couldn't come today. Yes.
I mean, so far, there are several TMS companies using these machines, and some of them don't deliver single pass that go just one direction. The other one goes all the way around, and you can actually decide what you want to do, but there's very low control that is just did it and then they set it and not improve the control.
Just one more question. When you said that powder,
Yeah, that's it. So
When you
I'm
said
pretty
that-
old, so there's problems with.
controllability of object and action is different, while they were both controlled by the same part of the brain. So what makes the difference in the response? When you're stimulating one, and you are stimulating the part that is actually
Important for action, not for. First of all, action is more difficult task. Naming action is more difficult than naming object. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is that area should be involved mainly in naming action, because that area actually controls the selection of the right answer. So you have to get the right response, and that area should control this kind of process.
the object is controlled by the different part.
Objects should be controlled from a different part, but also, as we show in that experiment, object is much easier task. So maybe in fMRI we don't see activation of that area when the subject is naming objects, because that area is little activated by object, because the task for that area is very easy.
So you had ceiling effect,
Yes,
basically,
there might be a ceiling effect sometimes.
to start with. There was not much improvement. Okay, I know that you have more questions, I have lots too, but I've been asking Carlo the entire day. But I would like to thank him and give him a small souvenir from the University of Manitoba. He's around, and you can stay around and ask more questions and also help yourself with the sandwiches. But thank you again, Carlo,
Thank you.
for coming.
Thank you.